Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the opening of what is commonly known as Black History Month, but we are here to celebrate, uplift, and affirm the collective African diaspora, not just this month, but all through the month. My name is Lamisha. I use she, her pronouns, and I serve as the director of the Multicultural Resource Center. And we are here to welcome back to our UCSF community the wonderful Mr. Dante King. We are joined by members of the Multicultural Resource Center, the Preterm Birth Initiative, and other campus colleagues to share their wisdom and engage in a dialogue with Mr. King. And so from here, I'm going to pass it off to
Alexis Cobbins.
Alexis. There you are. Alexis, please introduce yourself to the group, and thank you for the handoff and thank you for being here.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Dante King's book launch. My name is Alexis Cobbins. I am the executive director of the California Preterm Birth Initiative. And we are working with Dante internally on our racial equity journey. And I just want to say that his work has been so monumental to us, so inspirational, so effective in helping us fine-tune our programming in a way that is culturally respectful, relevant, and responsive to the needs of the Black community. And Dante is truly a humanitarian. He has impacted the lives of so many of us. I get feedback from people all across UCSF that have attended his events or read his work. And he is helping to validate the ways in which we have all as Black people felt in this country. And his work is so important. And I know that he is, not only is he working with us here at UCSF, he's been doing work with Johns Hopkins and with the Mayo Clinic. And so I'm just really inspired by Dante and proud of Dante. And we'll pass it off to Dante to get us started.
Wow, thank you, Alexis, for that intro. I want to say thank you to Dr. Hill and to Melissa Bautista here at the UCSF Multicultural Center Office of Diversity and Outreach, as well as Benjamin Wallen, who's taking care of the sound today. I also want to start this off by saying that by dedicating this program and my work to my mom, who is Deborah King Cooper, who's on here watching, I believe, somewhere today. My dad, Harold James King, my brother, Dewan King. I also want to recognize the presence of my grandparents who are no longer with me and with us, but that I know are here in spirit. And I want to recognize and dedicate this program to my dear sister, Lenitra Williams, who passed away around this time last year. And my friend, Kathy Broussard, who's suffering some loss right now. I also want to give a shout out and really thank the people who are part of my tribe who encourage me and who have been such pillars of strength for me in this work. Many of you, some of you of which who are here today. So we have executive director of the Preterm Birth Initiative, Alexis Cobbins, who just kicked things off. We've also got the deputy director of the California Preterm Birth Initiative, Solaire Spellin. There's Jessica Brown here, Alicia St. Andrews, Chiamaka Ogwegbu, Segiel Johannes, and Jayantra Henderson, who are just very special individuals to me. I thank you for agreeing to take this time today to do this, to kick off this event, which is very special to me. And I also want to uplift and give a special thank you again to Executive Director Alexis Cobbins and Dr. Larry Rand, who serves as the Principal Investigator of the California Preterm Birth Initiative, and the entire team over at the California Preterm Birth Initiative. You all have done so much to amplify the work that I'm doing, and it's expanded across the UCSF organization. So I'm just very grateful for all of the opportunities that have surfaced and prevailed over the last few years, where this work has been able to be embraced or presented, if you will, and embraced. And so this event today was so important because I wanted to have the opportunity to launch the book as widely as possible. And in doing so, have an initial conversation around my reasons for writing it and kind of the origins of that, what went into it. And I also wanted to spend some time with folks clarifying and or demystifying certain aspects of the work in a way where we process reflections together. And so again, some of the people who are nearest and dearest to me have agreed to do this, and we'll get started. So why don't we all come onto the screen and show ourselves, wonderful people. And I'll turn it over to Alexis. You can get us started with just kind of sharing some of your thoughts about the book itself, The 400-Year Holocaust. And again, the whole name is The 400-Year Holocaust, White America's Legal, Psychopathic, and Sociopathic Black Genocide, and the Revolt Against Critical Race Theory. So Alexis.
Yes, thank you. I think this is such a critical and important piece of work. It helps us to look at the history of this country with a different lens and a different frame, and a more appropriate frame. And that helps us really understand how deeply rooted in the fabric of this country anti-Blackness is. And it helps us also understand the reason why we see particular disparities in the Black community today. So I have two questions that I want to ask or have you speak to. One, just as I've been telling people about your book and trying to encourage everybody to buy your book, I've gotten some reactions to the title of your book. And so I'm wondering if you would speak to why you chose to name your book The 400-Year Holocaust and what that means.
Sure. So I think there are several reasons, and I also had mentioned this when we were talking about this last week, but Alicia St. Andrews is here, and she was reading through a very rough draft of the book some time ago, and one of the things she caught on to is I mentioned in the book that the experiences of Black people has been so severe, and the magnitude of terror that Black people have faced, that Black Americans in particular have faced in this country at the hands of not only white extremists per se, but leaders of our institutions, past and present, but really throughout the trajectory of the evolution of this cultural development, if you will, has been that of the Holocaust, has been reflective of that. And so if you look at that word, the definition, as noted, or widely known definition, is that it's that of mass destruction, if you will. One of the other reasons for choosing it is in 1916, there was an American eugenicist by the name of Madison Grant. And he had a book called The Passing of the Great Race. Some of the things that Dr. Grant stated in his book, and I'll just read a few quotes, not to go into too much. But he says that whenever the incentive to imitate the dominant race is removed, the Negro, or for that matter, the Indian, reverts shortly to his ancestral grade of culture. In other words, it is the individual and not the race that is affected by religion, education, and other things. Negroes have demonstrated throughout recorded time that they are a stationary species and that they do not possess the potentiality of progress or initiative from within. Progress from self-impulse must not be confounded with mimicry or with progress imposed from without by social pressure or the slaver's lash. He also said, when the impulse of an inferior race to imitate or mimic the dress, manners, or morals of the dominant race is destroyed by the acquisition of political or social independence, the subservient race tends to revert to its original status, as in Haiti. So he had a lot of derogatory concepts that he espoused about Black people. The entire book was the prioritization of Anglo-Europeans, particularly that of like Western Europe, Northern, as superior, and that Black people were substantially inferior and below not only white people, but those that he classified as non-Negroes, right? So we're at the lowest of the totem pole. You then have the Supreme Court of the United States, who in 1927 upheld a ruling that compulsory sterilization of the unfit was legal. From that legislation, you can follow what some have referred to as an all-out campaign to compulsory target Black women and Black men to some degree, but particularly Black women and young Black girls, if you will. What's interesting about that is I recently was teaching a course through UCSF, and I had this doctor, an older white male doctor, say to me that when he was a resident at Duke University, this was in the early to mid 1970s, that he worked with others to locate 16-year-old Black virgins and gave them hysterectomies, okay? What is very interesting to know, and the correlation that I wanna make or connection, is that Adolf Hitler looked to Madison Grant. He looked to his work. He was a huge fan of his work. And he espoused that book, The Passing of the Great Race, should be held as a Bible, okay? And so in making the connection to the Holocaust, there are many connections to be made. And if you go back to the colonial period, you look at laws such as the law of 1669, a law in 1669 that was titled the Casual Killing Act, which basically said that it conditioned white people to be able to murder Black people and not only not be accountable legally, but to not really have any moral accountability whatsoever. And the law read that these white Anglo-Europeans would be acquitted if within the chastisement of Black people, if the Black person happened to die, they would be free and acquit. You've got subsequent laws. There's one in 1672 that provides the same thing. And it also puts a bounty on both Black people, Negroes, and Indians. And the bounty for murdering an Indian is 3,000 pounds of tobacco in cask, whereas the bounty for murdering a Black person, for murdering a Negro, is 4,500 pounds of tobacco in cask. You've got subsequent laws in 1680 that are permitting the murder and the dehumanization and subjugation of Black people. And it is explicitly building it into the cultural affect of what evolves into white America, a white America value system that is conditioning not only white people But everyone in our culture, including Black people and those who then integrate into this country later on, to be against Black people and to not have any empathy and or any psychological or moral compass when it comes to dehumanizing Black people. And so if you follow this trajectory all the way through, and I'm talking about not just looking at events, but through a legal lens, of which some I will share today, it is a Holocaust. It's been a Holocaust for Black people in the most treacherous and vile ways. And we need to begin to amplify that and parade it for what it's been. And it's one of the main reasons why so many today are not wanting critical race theory, if you will, to take more commercial flight. I mean, it's been around for 50 plus years, but there's rampant reactions against it because this is the history and the perpetual culture of this country. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for educating us about that. My second question is related. You kind of started speaking to it already, but was there a pivotal moment, or like what got you to the place of, I need to write this book? I know that you had been doing teaching and training, but also wondering if there was like a specific thing or what got you to the point of like, I need to memorialize this in a book.
Yeah, so I'll try to be brief. So a few of the reasons I'll point out, I point to many in the book that I try to state up front, but I wanted to uplift and amplify the perspectives and experiences of Black people, both past and present. Many times when we do share what we have to endure day to day, it gets played down or diluted. There isn't much of a cultural capacity or appetite to hear it, to honor it. And with so many different studies, right? There are so many bias studies, unfavorable bias studies that point to the ways in which Black people are seen and or viewed through a tainted psychology that is one that is colored by insufficiency or deficiency, et cetera. I also wanted to reignite the discussion in ways that recognizes and acknowledges, again, just the daily experiences of Black Americans while providing validation and credence to those experiences. I felt it necessary to share the work widely rather than limiting the reach of my work to the courses that I teach, which many of you are familiar with. And I also wanted to be able to convey the pain and the sorrow that I feel, that I carry within me before I die. I started to feel like I was not gonna make it to 50 years old. And understanding what I now understand as this all-out campaign against Black people psychologically, emotionally, culturally, et cetera, due to my own encounters and also that of the studies that I've undertaken, I needed to be able to leave something behind and to contribute to a conversation that so many other Black scholars, literaries, and everyday people have contributed to for centuries, decades and centuries. So those are some of the reasons.
And we so appreciate you for bringing this into the scholarship. I don't know if there's a particular order or I can just pass it to someone. I'll pass it to Solaire Spelling.
I felt like you were going to pass it to me, Alexis. Thank you. So I have a question for you, Dante. And I'll just start by sharing that when I attended one of your first trainings for me, it was like 4 or 5 years ago, that was the first time that I had ever learned or heard about the psychopathic and sociopathic elements of anti-Black racism. And it's so critical to really understanding how it operates. It's important to understand with that framing. But also, I feel like it is something that's unique and it's often left out or absent from our traditional racial equity trainings that you would get. And so I'm wondering if you could talk about why this is so important. It's so important that it's in the title of your book. So if you could just share a little bit more about that.
Yeah, this might be somewhat of a long answer, and I think I'll share some of the slides now. I see you smiling, Chiamaka. I'm going to get you. So I think to Larry's point, and I'm going to pull few of the slides that I share in my deck. So the first one looking at, and this is just at the period to where the United States begins to form, but the Naturalization Act of that was formed between 1789 and 1791, which basically stated that America was being founded as a white country, along with the Constitution. But this particular piece of legislation is extremely explicit because it says that in order to become a citizen, that any alien being a free white person, so you have to be white, and you have to have resided within the limits and under the jurisdiction of the United States for the term of 2 years. But this grants all rights, all privileges. So the United States is founded on white supremacy. It's also founded upon the cultural affect of anti-Blackness that has already been built through the colonial period. And I spoke of some examples a moment ago. I give a pretty extensive definition in my book around anti-Blackness, but anti-Blackness, in the short version, involves the criminalization, hypernegativity, hyperscrutiny, and negative positioning of Blackness through American institutions, right? And so if we look at, for example, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, what this law did, one of the things, or a few of the things that this law did, was it required white people to catch any slave or person that was alleged to be a runaway slave. And it did not exempt free Black people at all. So if white people suspected, which is very key, if they suspected that a Black person was a runaway slave, they could remand them and turn them in. And I believe they were paid $1,000 if they did so, right? So you've got the systems of white capitalism and economics working with the government to facilitate all-out terror on Black people. It also amplified and administered in a way, or gave credence to, white suspicion that a white person who is a citizen, any person could suspect that a Black person is a runaway slave or shouldn't be anywhere at any given time. It reinforced rather, not legitimized, because there's white suspicion and white comfort and white perspectives and existence was already legitimized and situated in the cultural context, but it further amplified white suspicion, embedding it into the legal context. I apologize for not giving a trigger warning before showing this. And this is pretty explicit, so I truly apologize if this shocks anyone. But I want to pull from this paper called Rape as a Badge of Slavery. It says, raping a Black woman was not a crime for the majority of this nation's history. First, the rape of a Black woman was simply not criminalized. And even when there was an argument that a statute was race neutral as to victimization, prosecutorial inaction and court holdings made clear the lack of recourse for Black women who were raped. In fact, a white defendant could argue that his indictment ought to be dismissed for failing to state the victim was white. You've got both by statute, and these are examples of statutes from Kentucky, Virginia, Missouri, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, where Black women are exempted from rape law. There's no protection for Black women. And we know both by historical record and by the sheer numbers of the way that things prevailed and the number of mixed children, if you will, mulatto, quadroon, octoroon, as they were noted, the prevalence of those children, of that population occurring throughout the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, and also bolstered or sanctioned by laws like the law of 1662, where they basically passed laws that said that if a white man was caught, or white male or woman was caught having intercourse or having engaged in intercourse with a Black woman or man, that they would be fined, but there was no protection for actual rape, if you will. So Black women are exempted from all of these statutes. They're exempted. These statutes only apply to the protection of white women. So you've got white femininity that's protected through these laws, and just the existence of white girls and women. White men are exempted from most of these statutes, meaning that there are no laws that criminalize white men for the act of rape. These laws all situate Black men in the Black profile as that of those who are noted as rapists, right? Even through court decisions. This is Missouri 1855. We know, based on the information that is just widely known or available, if you will, that this young girl, Celia, who was being raped by her master at the time, Robert Newsom, of whom she had 2 children by previously and was pregnant with the 3rd one, that he had continued to rape her, and that she had sought out help to try to be protected, to try to get help to stop the abuse. The judge in this case, Judge William A. Hall, stated, he gave instruction to the jury, and he defined the rape as intercourse. He said if Newsom was in the habit of having intercourse with the defendant who was his slave and went to her cabin on the night he was killed to have intercourse with her or for any other purpose, and while he was standing in the floor talking to her, she struck him with a stick, which was a dangerous weapon, and knocked him down, and struck him again after he fell and killed him by either blow. It is murder in the 1st degree. He criminalized her, he sentenced her to 1st degree murder, or gave instruction for them to convict her of 1st degree murder, which was later appealed, but then the higher court upheld it, the Supreme Court. There's no accountability, because you've got the people who are part of the cultural terror enacting laws, either through statute or decisions, that sanction that Black people are not human in every way. And so in this particular example, it's not rape, it's intercourse, right? You've got the Supreme Court in Mississippi that rules in the case of a Black girl who was raped by a Black male slave, that rape was only rape if it was committed upon the person of a white woman. You've got in 1918, this is beyond the period of enslavement, right? The Florida Supreme Court rendering that because Black women, they deem that Black women come from a race of people who are immoral in nature, that Black women can't be raped. What has been said by some of our courts about an unchaste female being a comparatively rare exception is no doubt true, where the population is composed largely of the Caucasian race. But we would blind ourselves to actual conditions if we adopted this rule, where another race is largely immoral. That is largely immoral constitutes an appreciable part of the population. So because Black women are Black and are immoral, they can't be raped, right? We see this again in the case of Recy Taylor, with the lawyer in this case who's representing the defendants who actually raped her. This is in Abbeville, Alabama. He's saying to her husband, it says here in the article, "Nigger, ain't $600 enough for raping your wife?" The governor of this state failed to bring charges against the rapist initially, but then Rosa Parks, who rallied vigorously on behalf of Recy Taylor, she was able to garner enough attention to the case where they convened a grand jury, but they still didn't convict them. And so you've got this attitude, if you will, that we even see with people like President Abraham Lincoln, who says in 1858, I will say then that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and Black races, that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. And I will say, in addition to this, that there is a physical difference between the white and Black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. And inasmuch as they cannot so live, while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior. And I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race. So I'll stop there, I'll pause, but I think we need to take a very deep look at the ways in which this culture and its leaders, through a legal perspective, through a cultural perspective, through a functioning and functional perspective, has been designed to create a psychology that is indeed psychopathic and sociopathic towards Black people.
I'm happy to, oh, go ahead, Dante.
Oh, I didn't know if Solaire was.
That was my question, but you, Dante.
Okay.
And I'll second that. Thank you for unpacking that, Dante. It just kind of shows the sheer attention to detail and depth that went into the entire book. And I feel like that was a strong example of it. My question focuses more on kind of your process for writing the book and the approach that you took. And yeah, could you just walk us through that a little bit? I know it was just a lot of content to get through, a heavy emotional impact. And so could you just walk us through, how you approach that, both from a procedural standpoint, but just handling also the personal impact of compiling this work as well?
Yeah, I think what was most difficult in this process was deciding just how much. I've got thousands of examples that I could have used or leveraged, and I do go through a pretty substantial number of examples when I teach the course, especially if I'm doing like a 12-week series, or even in kind of the 2-day series, we go through how this psychology and how these attitudes from a regulatory standpoint and all of America's institutions, and from a cultural standpoint, have been infused and were infused and perpetuated and reinforced throughout American institutions, particularly in the medical field. There are so many examples. There's no shortage of examples. And so it was important for me to make the point without overwhelming people too much. But that was also hard because it left me not knowing whether the point would be made adequately, or whether or not there was adequate detail in the book itself, which is why I kind of state over and over again up front and throughout the text, to please engage in other forms, particularly in the courses that I teach, which one is available here through UCSF, offered through their Office of Continuing Medical Education. And then there's another longer series that's available through my website, and or organizations partner with me and bring me in for trainings. People can access the material that way, but I would hope that people did access one of those as additional vehicles, because the purpose of, or the intention of the book was to be used as a prerequisite and or an ancillary tool to accompany the course. But as I get feedback from people like yourselves, I'm understanding more that many of the points that I intended to transmit in the ways in which I intended them to, that they are transmitting in that way. So is that helpful? Or did that answer your question? Okay. Who's next? I see.
Oh, I'll let you call.
Oh, go ahead, Jess.
Oh, yeah. I'm just taking a moment from all that you broke down, and I appreciate Chiamaka resending us back to like why you wrote this book. And this question may take us back to what you've already explained, but I think for me, and we always talk about this, I always thought about what it means to be a good Black. So following the rules, making sure I've done everything well, I'm non-threatening, I'm educated, and that would absolve me from experiencing racism. And what you just explained to me right now, or you just showcased us right now about this false ideology of white morality. I'm wondering if you could really unpack that a little bit more and how that plays into the psychopathy of anti-Blackness, and how with all these laws that you listed, there's also this moral standing, or this false moral standing by, white supremacy standards on what morality is and what that looks like. And I was wondering if you can unpack that a little bit more with us with everything that you just discussed. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, it does make sense. So I'll give actually one example, going back to the colonial period, because I think it's more easily seen, if you will, in looking at this. And I think to understand that during the colonial period, America is being established as a Christian country, right? And the remnants of that, as different sects of Christianity emerge throughout the 18th century, throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, they impact, kind of the American religious apparatus, if you will, through different sects of religion: Presbyterianism, the Baptist Church, AME, et cetera, right? But if you go back to that period during colonialism, I'll give just one example. This law, an act preventing Negro insurrections, it says, whereas the frequent meeting of considerable numbers of Negro slaves under pretense of feasts and burials is judged of dangerous consequence, for prevention whereof for the future, be it enacted by the King's most excellent majesty, by and with the consent of the General Assembly, and it is hereby enacted by the authority aforesaid, that from and after the publication of this law, it shall not be lawful for any Negro or other slave to carry or arm himself with any club, staff, gun, sword, or any other weapon of defense or offense, nor to go or depart from his master's ground without a certificate from his master, mistress, or overseer, and such permission not to be granted but upon particular and necessary occasions. And every Negro or slave so offending, not having a certificate as aforesaid, shall be sent to the next constable, who is hereby enjoined and required to give the said Negro 20 lashes on his bare back, well laid on, and so sent home to his said master, mistress, or overseer. And it is further enacted by the authority aforesaid that if any Negro or other slave shall presume or lift up his hand in opposition against any Christian shall for every such offense upon due proof made there by the oath, just by the very word of the party before a magistrate, have and receive 30 lashes on his bare back well laid on. So I just want to make a quick point, and then I'm going to continue, that this law is conditioning white people to be able to do whatever they want to Black people, to degrade, dehumanize in the worst ways. It's also conditioning Black people in ways where there is total fear of white people. If a white person says that you intended harm to them, that you lifted up your hand, you did anything to evoke any type of fear in them or potential threat, that you would be subject to 30 lashes, right? The last point I want to make, it goes on to say, and it is hereby further enacted by the authority aforesaid, that if any Negro or other slave shall absent himself from his master's service and lie hid and lurking in obscure places, committing injuries to the inhabitants, and shall resist any person or persons that shall by any lawful authority be employed to apprehend and take the said Negro, that then, in case of such resistance, it shall be lawful for such person or persons to kill the said Negro or slave so lying out and resisting, and that this law be once every 6 months published at the respective county courts and parish churches within these colonies. And so being founded as a Christian nation, you've got literally for almost the first, really the first 160, 70 years of this cultural evolution, laws and actions that are being enacted that are shaping cultural behaviors, the cultural aesthetic of America. And this is being done by people who consider themselves God-loving, God-affirmed, Christian, moral people. So these actions, legalized terror, legalized rape, in essence, sits at the core of white morality. These laws are published at churches. These laws are published everywhere. And so right after prayer, we're going to introduce a new piece of legislation or statute that says you can murder Black people. You can actually chastise them if they happen to die. It won't be a felony. You'll be acquitted. If you happen to kill them or murder them, if they're resisting the rape of one of their family members or any type of, personal rape or dehumanization, if they fight for themselves and you happen to do anything to them that, murders them or hurts them pretty significantly, that there's total absolution for it. Dr. Hill?
Thank you, Dante. And to our campus community and our audience, I just want to acknowledge that sort of the importance of acknowledging and putting forward a trigger warning. I know there's a lot of imagery in the slides that may activate folks, and also the language that is used and it is re-shared. And I just want to say that in terms of our principles of community, we do want to be mindful about repeating language, even in a historical context, as it still is impactful and may bump against our values for inclusion. So just a gentle warning and not a full-on distraction, but I do want to say that to our community.
Who's next?
I can provide a reflection. I think defining whiteness as anything less than psychopathic is insane and delusional. And reflecting on me and my white ancestors who traded our humanity for laws and institutional power. And that's what's crazy. And being able to define whiteness as psychopathic has been a true gift of sanity, which I hope more people can receive from Dante's work. And that leads me to my question for you around reading your book, in that many of us gratefully received and experienced your work and the depth of your research around anti-Blackness and white psychopathy through your trainings and through community organizing and policy and advocacy work. And hoping you can just talk more about the connection between your book and your training and the actions that you've also inspired people to take, and how readers and people in your trainings can continue to join you for further learning and action.
Thank you for that reflection, Alicia. And you know, this framing and the language that's used in this text, which is very strong, and I know that it may resonate for some. I know I'm getting feedback from all Black people, many Black people of different walks of life, who are saying to me that the book resonates for them, with them deeply. And on the other side of that, I'm getting feedback from a lot of white people who are unhappy about the language that I've used in the book. They think it's strong, radical. There's offense taken to the word Holocaust. I mean, someone even wrote a question in the chat that I want to get to as well, about the imagery on the book cover, right? And how that is reflective of imagery that they are familiar with that's linked to the Jewish Holocaust. And I think that there's room to raise up how these experiences have been very similar in nature, but also how they've been structured and contrived in different ways. And while there are shared experiences in terms of both the psychological, emotional, and physical terror that these groups have experienced, that all of our ancestors, for those that have been impacted by these things, that all of our ancestors have experienced, we also need to be able to look at the ways in which, in a very nuanced fashion, the ways in which these experiences took flight, and they differed as well. And so when I saw the picture, for example, in terms of the imagery that I saw on the cover, I want to get back to your question too, Alicia. It was reflective of internment camps that both Black people were subjected to. We don't necessarily call them internment camps per se, we call them plantations, but they were internment camps. We don't call it in criminality or imprisonment, we call it slavery or enslavement, but those were prison camps that Black people were on. And the fact that there can sometimes be a lack of deference to that, or a lack of an ability to hold it or recognize and or see it as such, or even in a similar context, speaks to the way in which anti-Blackness functions, right? That we can't really hold the Black experience. We've got to say, well, this group experienced this, and this group experienced this too, and this group experienced that. And I'm able to hold them all, and I don't feel the need to ever try and hold them together to minimize or delegitimize one experience over the other. I'm able to hold them all. And so I think we need to get to a point where we're able to question what is it that compels us to want to diminish and or minimize the magnitude of anti-Blackness and how it has functioned both past and present? I think the courses that I provide, especially in the longer ones, provide the space to be able to do that. Because I think when you spend many hours with this material, and especially considering it through a legal frame, you can begin to, it becomes clearer. You can, one can begin to analyze it and synthesize it and reframe it in a multitude of ways that just aren't possible if you only read the cover or the excerpt from the book that's posted on Amazon and then you form an opinion about it. One of the things I say up front in the book, in a letter that's pinned to Black people, is that I do believe many Jewish people will be able to relate to this text based on what's stated within it. But again, you won't get that if you don't get the book, if you don't read it. So hopefully that was insightful. Thank you, Alicia. Segel, and then JJ.
Dante, thank you so much. I think that was just such a brilliant segue into the question I have for you, which came about as I was sitting and reading the book and imagining what the experience might be of non-Black people, and particularly white people in reading this book and the reactions they might have, and almost reflexes that are in the hopes of essentially being motivated to read the book in order to alleviate a sense of guilt, engage in performative allyship, and then essentially, after reading the book, be able to engage in an inappropriate self-congratulation after having read your book. So I really wonder, what is your advice about how people should prepare their mindset to be before even picking up the book and also while reading the book?
That's a great question. Thank you, Segel. I think that people have to be in a space of assuming the position of a Black person. Read it from that place of first person. What if this was your experience? For those who are not Black, and it is not your experience, and try to see it as such. Many times I have to do that, especially as an HR professional. Whenever, for example, I remember discussing some years ago a situation that had occurred on the job where this woman had made certain gestures and taken actions toward a male employee. And I was kind of discussing it hypothetically with my mom, and she was like, well, that's not sexual harassment. They might have been playing around. And the woman had actually taken her hands and gone up the man's lap. And I said to my mother, well, what if it was the other way around and he had taken his hands and gone up her legs, into her skirt? And my mom was like, well, that's sexual harassment, right? She could see it that way, and she wasn't necessarily able to see it the other way. And I invite everyone to always do that. When you don't get something, just reframe it in a context that you're more familiar with. And in this case, try to step outside of yourself and think about, how you would feel, what impact what this have on you, and what impact do you think this would have on you if these things had happened to your community, to your group, to your parents, to your grandparents, if they were subject to it. What type of emotional connection would you have to it? And I would also invite you to consider, if that emotional connection is not present, why is that? Where is that empathy deficit? Why is there an empathy deficit? Where does that come from? Why does that exist? And I do believe that and I have a friend who also, well, I won't mention it, but one of the things we talk about is the empathy deficit as it pertains to Black people in this country. And there are so many reasons why, right? We're in a cultural context that is not ours as African people, as people who are predominantly African in our ancestry. We have been made to assimilate and conform to Eurocentricity, Eurocentric standards of education, of communication, of education, of laws and policies that are enacted unfavorably towards us and in favor of white people. And even in our conformity, as we have conformed, we still are not accepted, right? We still are not celebrated and or embraced. And so some of the things that I take to task in my book is the whole notion of equality and equity, that there could ever be that, when that is not the objective of white people in this country. Their objective has been to be superior and to remain superior in everything. And that is the way that the culture has been designed. And it also has been designed in ways that plays tricks on African Americans. And this is true for other groups and races too, but I'm dealing with the way in which, in my observation, in my studies, I have analyzed and or have come to understand how this occurs. But it plays tricks on us so much so that we can be in 2022 and be proud of the first Black this, or the first Black that, or the first Black, when that whole setup or arrangement is a mechanism of oppression. It's a narrative that perpetuates the oppression and keeps the oppression going. And if we're guided to celebrate incremental progress, then we will also be striving for, seeking, and celebrating incremental progress. And I believe that in doing these things, it just perpetuates a situation of lack and of dehumanization for Black people. Because we always are comparing Black progress and the progress that Black people have made to the conditions of enslavement, of that of our ancestors who were dehumanized. There aren't many conversations that take the situation of Black people and compare the progress of Black people to that of white people, because if we did that, we would come up with a different sum total. We wouldn't see the progress as incremental progress. We would have a different, it would have a different meaning for us all. And so there are a lot of things that I mean, and then not just myself, I point to so many other people that I reference in the book, which I hope that you'll go and get some of their books too, such as Tracy O'Neill and The Exceptional Negro, Dr. Ibram Kendi and his book around, Stamped from the Beginning, which was his first book, and then How to Be an Anti-Racist. You've got Dr. Bobby Wright and the Psychopathic Racial Personality, Dr. Alvin Poussin. I mean, there's so many people that have taken these things to task, and I believe that it's important that we reignite these perspectives in the literature that has been provided for us to own this conversation from our experiences. I said, one of the things I'll say, and I'll be quiet, is that Black people are the experts on racism. Black people are the experts on anti-Black racism. And Malcolm X said that roughly almost 60 years ago. He says, Negroes in this country are the authority on it. And I agree with that.
That ties very closely to my reflection just of my work with you over the past couple of years, Dante, and reading the book. I think so often when you study like diversity, equity, inclusion, it's it can be taught from a standpoint of like, well, we just ended up here. Like there was enslavement and then these things happened and now we're here. And I would always just remember feeling like, but why though? Like it can't just keep happening if there's all these white people, all these other people of color who like want things to be better for Black people. So like, why aren't they? And you really just highlight the intentionality and the construction and like how closely tied all of our institutions are into upholding anti-Blackness and white supremacy. And like working with your material, it's such a wide range of emotions. I feel like it's like hopelessness, despair, depression, anger, frustration, rage. And then at the same time, it's also like, I feel senses of like clarity and understanding and even like healing because I'm like, okay, it's not me. It's not me. Like, I know something's off here. It's not my family. It's not other people that I love. Like something in the system is, it was built this way. And so I think especially for Black people, like just being met with all the triggering things, the trauma, like the real history, like what do you really want Black people to be able to take away from the book?
I want us, and thank you so much, JJ, for framing that question the way that you did. I want Black people to take away exactly what you said, that everything about what we experience in this culture that we find as lunacy or as crazy or as abusive, that it's valid, that there's credence to this experience, that it is not just microaggression, right? And I think using language like that, microaggressions or racism, which really is an ambiguous term, does not speak to the severity of the experiences and the violence that we endure, that we have had to endure, both past and present. And I'm going to give you another example of this, right? So you've got in the United States v. Cruikshank in 1876, the Supreme Court ruled that the 14th Amendment was not designed to protect individuals against the actions of other individuals, but only from those of the state itself, right? So actions that are taken by the state. This ruling came about because in 1873, you had the Colfax Massacre, where Black people who were trying to exercise their right to vote, they were attacked by white people who did not want them to participate in the elections, right? And so there were 100 to 150 Black people who were massacred. And the case made its way all up to the Supreme Court, and they ruled that the rights of Black people were not protected in essence. You've also got United States v. Harris in 1883, where the US Supreme Court dismissed indictments against the Tennessee sheriff and accomplices who were accused of attacking 4 Black men and killing 1. The court held that the Force Act, which was an act that Congress enacted in 1871, a federal law passed to protect Black Americans from violent terrorism, was unconstitutional because the 14th Amendment limited Congress to taking remedial steps against state action that violated the 14th Amendment and applied only to acts by states, not to acts of individuals. So it was interpreted in ways that served to enact, to disposition and to displace and to further marginalize Black people. And so from these rulings, you've got lynchings, mass lynchings that occur from this period into the mid 20th century, into the present, really, that have continued to go on. But the difference is that they went on without a lack of accountability in most cases, right? Even to the point where you've got postcards like this. These are postcards, many of them, that begin to be widely distributed, right? And we're not talking about the Casual Killing Act of 1669 or the act preventing Negro insurrections in 1680. We're talking about widespread, rampant terror that was facilitated by the highest court in the United States. And then there was a lack of enforcement and or accountability that states upheld in regard to the protection of Black people. And I point to this one particular article here. This is the John Hartfield lynching. He was lynched because he was dating a white woman, but it says John Hartfield will be lynched, not was lynched. John Hartfield will be lynched by Ellisville mob at 5 o'clock this afternoon. Governor Bilbo says he is powerless to prevent it. Thousands of people are flocking into Ellisville to attend the event. Sheriff and authorities are powerless to prevent it, right? So bear with me because I'm going somewhere in sharing this. So you've got people, here's another one. Wow. Just awful. And as I share these with you, I just want you to look at the normalcy of this, that these events, that these acts were normal and due to a conditioning that sanctioned that this was ordinary, that this was part of the cultural, psychological value system. It was a part of the spiritual and emotional value system, right? So Ida B. Wells says, our country's national crime is lynching. It is not the creature of an hour, the sudden outburst of uncontrolled fury, or the unspeakable brutality of an insane mob. It represents cool, calculating deliberation of intelligent people who openly avow that there is an unwritten law that justifies them in putting human beings to death without complaint under oath, without trial by jury, without opportunity to make defense, and without right of appeal. So from our entrance into the American continent, if you will, from beginning throughout the trajectory, both past into the present, there is a psychology that provides that whether we're talking about incidents or instances with law enforcement, whether we're talking about interactions we have with our doctors, taking our children to school, becoming employed and trying to function adequately on our jobs, running our own businesses. This cultural psychology provides that Black people in America, and particularly African Americans, are public enemy number one. And you see this through housing policy, both past and present. So you've got Euclid v. Ambler, which upheld that racial zoning ordinances could, in effect, be legal in a sense. The Supreme Court ruled that ordinances, in this particular case, was not an unreasonable extension of the village's police power and did not have the character of arbitrary fiat. You've got Corrigan v. Buckley that upholds that racial restrictive covenants are legal. And so there's widespread prioritization of white people when it comes to accessing quality housing. The government within the following decade, provides programs through the Homeowners Loan Corporation and other such entities, the Federal Housing Administration that provides subsidies to families, predominantly and particularly white families. There were programs that or clauses that sanctioned that Black people could not have access to these programs. You've got reports that are written in every city, for every city and locale across this country. This is one from San Francisco. And I'm just giving a few examples. It says many nationalities are represented, but there is no inharmonious racial concentration, right? Wherever Black people are mentioned, the language is different. This is for Fillmore. That one was for Bernal Heights. This is for the Fillmore. It says this area of some 20 blocks occupies a comparatively level section which is inhabited by semi-skilled laborers, low-wage white-collar workers, and service group employees with incomes ranging from $1,000 to $2,000. There is a decided concentration of undesirable racial elements. More than half the Negro population of San Francisco are located here, and it is considered a highly hazardous area. If you go to Oakland, the same thing here. This is a zoning report for Oakland. Down at the bottom, under clarifying remarks, it says population increasing slightly due to tendency toward multiple residential. This might be termed a high red area and would have been graded C, except for the presence of Negro residents. And so you can come to 2022, and it says a Black couple erased themselves from their home to see if the appraised value would go up. It did, by nearly $500,000. So when this Black couple they erased all of their photos from their home, they took anything out that would signify that a Black family lived there, and they had their white neighbors stand in for them. This is here in the Bay Area. In 2020, between 2020 and 2021, the appraisal went up almost $500,000 when the white neighbor stood in. So President Richard Nixon, and I think we have to listen to what people have told us. He says you have to face the facts. The whole problem is really the Blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this without appearing to, right? And that's 1969. So you go to people like Dr. Alvin Pusani, he says, I think we have to establish that white racism is a mental illness. Many white social scientists would like to define racism as something that is normal, as a cultural variant. As long as we approach it that way, we really do not deal with the pathology of racism itself. It's like saying that cancer, because a lot of people have it in this society, is somehow normal. Dr. Bobby Wright, in his work, The Psychopathic Racial Personality, he says, in their relationship with the Black race, Europeans are psychopaths, and their behavior represents an underlying biologically transmitted proclivity with roots deep in their evolutionary history. The psychopath is an individual who is constantly in conflict with other persons or groups. He is unable to experience guilt, is completely selfish and callous, and has a total disregard for the rights of others. One of the best methods that can be used to measure the psychopathic traits of the white race is observing and analyzing their universal overt behaviors and attitudes toward Blacks. He also says psychopaths simply ignore the concept of right and wrong. By ignoring this trait in the white race, the lack of ethical and moral development, Blacks have made and are still making a tragic mistake in basing the worldwide Black liberation movement on moral suasion. It is pathological for Blacks to keep attempting to use moral suasion on a people who have no morality where race is the variable. And so what I also want to do is expand this, because this is not just about white people but this is more so about a culture that was built by white people, that white people have controlled, that white people have facilitated in a psychology that has been widely disseminated and adopted by everyone in American culture, even Black people. It's been adopted by, anti-Blackness has been adopted, and principles of white supremacy have been adopted by the Asian community, by the Latinx community, definitely by the Black community, by us all. And so there are ways in which we deal with Black people in this culture that, as a default, come from a negative place, and that we need to understand that these things have been built into the culture over time. So you go to Dr. Randy Borum, and I also quote from his work as well. He says the transition into becoming a terrorist is rarely sudden and abrupt. What we know of actual terrorists suggests that there is rarely a conscious decision made to become a terrorist. Most involvement in terrorism results from gradual exposure and socialization towards extreme behavior. And that's what all of these laws have done in terms of facilitating and enacting a culture that is hostile to Black people, even so that we could have this Black fifth grader, this Black male who went into a Safeway last year to buy his lunch once San Francisco returned our children back to school in person. He went in, his mom was out in the parking lot, she gave him money to go in, and the store security, employees of the store accused him of stealing. They stopped him in the store, would not let him go. You've got 4 12-year-old girls who, at the beginning of 2019, were strip searched because the school suspected that they were high because they were laughing and being giddy. And so they strip searched these 4 12-year-old girls. You've got Dr. Susan Moore, who was being treated for COVID-19 in the hospital. She was trying to let the physician know what she needed in terms of care because she was his colleague, and he accused her of being a drug addict. So I want Black people to know, going back to your question, JJ, and I want all people to know that this is more than implicit bias. This is not just about fragility. This is about an inherent fear of Black people and the pathology of Black people that has been built into this culture, and it is widely disseminated, and it shows up in infinite ways. There's not just one way, infinite ways.
Well, I think there are a couple of questions in the chat. Kiana Benson asked, what is your take on why anti-Blackness should be centered within the context of multiple anti-oppression movements? And she also added, I asked this because I struggle to explain it to others.
Well, I think we have to start from the baseline that we are all socialized through Eurocentricity. And in being socialized through Eurocentricity, we have all adopted a white, Anglo-European, Eurocentric, psychological, and institutional, cultural value system and structure within ourselves that provides that anti-Blackness, which is central to the American identity, that provides that we all have subscribed to that innately. We don't have to admit it, but it shows up in our internal reactions, in terms of what we think of Black people at any given point, who we're willing to give more or most of the benefit of the doubt to. There are reactions to it. I'll point to even these examples, right, that I have listed here, where you have Marion Scott, these young girls, Black girls, who are just trying to be themselves. And their schools come along and enact policies that are against them. So Marion, I'm not sure if the school necessarily adopted a policy, but they excluded her from the school picture because of the way that her mother chose to do her hair. Faith Finity, 11 years old at the time, she gets suspended because of her hairstyle, because the school enacts a policy that says that that hairstyle isn't permissible, that people have to wear their natural hair, right? So whether it's the way policies are being designed and enforced, or enforced, the people who find themselves on the bottom level, if you will, or disenfranchised, or on the side of an inequitable outcome or disparate treatment, are Black people, almost always, exclusively. And or if there is a hierarchy racially, we are typically at the bottom. And that can be observed and seen in the showcase of institutional outcomes that we see, as well as empirical evidence that is presented to us through media every day. And all you have to do is pay attention and subscribe to mainstream news, or look at Black news outlets such as the Black News Channel or Roland Martin Unfiltered on the Black Star Network, and you will begin to understand the types of experiences that Black people are having in America. And it's a totally different experience than most other racial groups within this country. And again, facilitated and enacted through American institutions.
There's another question from Bardia Faramand. What are your thoughts about how the new generation needs to be educated, both Blacks and whites? And are you hopeful what the next generation will bring to the table?
I have to say, that's my dentist. Hey, Dr. Faramand. So he takes care of my teeth. I love him and his family. He is one of my good friends. So if you don't have a dentist, go to him. No, but I think that there are many different avenues available to people in terms of resources. We have so many social media channels. I know I use a different a cadre of different forms of media, if you will, that are in my attempts to engage my audiences and the people that I have the opportunity to educate. But there are so many ways for people to self-educate, whether it be through books or through audiobooks or through just logging online and Googling a bunch of information, or if people want to go on YouTube and YouTube, oftentimes there are videos, many documentaries available, and or if people subscribe to podcasts. But I don't think that there's any shortage of information available to us, especially at the rate and pace by which information is now disseminated. And so there can be no excuse as to why people are ignorant and or don't know anything. And one of the things that I point to in terms of what I see as symptoms of a psychosis is that if there's a lack of urgency or concern, or people are not concerned with wanting to know or understand the ways in which America was founded on white supremacy and anti-Blackness, or if there's any contempt for assertions that anti-Blackness was the key foundational principle to racism in America, or if there's a disbelief that all of white power, all of white privilege, all of white advantage and advancement and opportunity, both past and present, is the result of a prioritization of white people within and throughout all American institutions, right? If people want to play that down, if people want to play down the fact that anti-Blackness has been structural and facilitated through all American institutions and our culture, right? I see that as not just someone having a negative biased attitude or racist attitude. That's a psychosis, because it doesn't consider the reality of factual evidence that we have at our disposal. So I think there are many ways that people can educate, Dr. Faramand.
Okay, and I know that we're coming to the end of our time. I think this will be a quick question to answer before we close out. Alvin Hendricks asked, is there a Black-owned vendor that I can purchase the book from?
That's a great question. I've been back and forth to Marcus Books. I'm actually going to drop some off there. So to Blanche Richardson, if you are on, I'm going to bring some books by and just co-opt them, because I'm not sure if it's available through Ingram. But I would, if you all could go out to Marcus Books here in Oakland, California, to purchase the book, and or if you want to order the book from them, I strongly suggest and recommend that you do that, because we do want to support Black-owned businesses, and particularly Black-owned bookstores. So thank you for that question, Alvin.
So we have about 5 minutes left. Is there anything that you want to close us out with today?
Yeah, I do want to say that I apologize to anyone who might have been shocked at the onset of the initial slides that I showed, because those are just hard. You know, they're hard for me in my work. They've been hard for me in terms of the ways in which sexual assault and sexual abuse has shown up for me personally and for members of my family and larger community. So I do want to say that. And yeah, but I don't apologize for the fact that I'm a messenger in bringing about a message that amplifies the experiences of Black people and experiences that have been realities for us. These are not just pictures on a PowerPoint slide. These are not just words or slides that I put together. These were enactments of circumstances that Black people have had to endure, that we continue to have to endure at the hands of a culture and people who are hostile to our nature. So, you know, anyone needing a trigger warning, I would ask you to think about the ways in which none of us were warned, none of our ancestors had warnings that they would be subjected to cultural terror, both through lynchings, rape, and the perpetual abuse that we see so many Black people enduring in the present. There's no trigger warnings for that. You know, so I would even offer for people to think about, where does that come from? You know, why are you so, I know for myself personally, I won't go into much of this, but I've had guns held to my head. I've been, you know, victims of being robbed because I grew up in a certain place per se. And so why are there some people who are so fragile to where they can't hear at the onset of hearing certain information or seeing certain pictures? It just provides so much of a problem. And I'm not saying for people who may have had like real life upsets per se, but I'm talking about if you have not had these experiences and you're coming from it as an external party and it's just too much for you to handle, or you don't think it's appropriate, where is that coming from? Because I would offer to you to think about the reality of experiencing it supersedes, takes precedence over, and is much more dire than discomfort. So with that's it for me. Does anyone else want to say anything before we close?
I just want to say really briefly, one, thank you doesn't describe the work and the weight of the work that you carry, Dante. And for you to immerse yourself in something that is not only so very deeply important, but also painful. You know, we will never know what it means to carry and to do the work that you do. And so thank you doesn't say enough for that. And to really acknowledge and to recognize that the lived experience of trauma for many, but exclusively for Black identified folks, historically and present, is very, very real. And even though we can talk about our experiences and find the silver lining and do things that we do in the spirit of resilience, does not mean that it is not done with great sorrow and holds great pain. And so to remember that as people can stand before you and not only tell their own stories, but that of their ancestors in such a way that you can receive it, please receive it with honor and respect. And so we just appreciate you, Dante. Alexis?
I just want to acknowledge to everyone that there is some information in the chat. If you have not yet read the book and want to read it, you have time to go out and get the book. And then there will be a Q&A session held with Dante on Tuesday, March 15th from 12 to 1:30. The information for that event is in the chat, so you can come back to that to ask Dante any questions that you may have after reading the book. And we want to thank you all for attending.
Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. The link to my website is also in the book as well. So please go subscribe there for updates. You can also get the book from the website as well if you cannot make it out to Marcus Books. And then there are also listings for the courses that are there as well. So if you can sign up for a course, if your job will pay for it, or if your organization wants to, bring me in to do some work, I can do that. But anyway, thank you so much, Dr. Hill. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you to all of you on this panel who agreed to share this moment with me. I love you and I appreciate you. Bye-bye.